In the weeks before the Great October Offensive at El Alamein, the Eighth Army fought a battle that was meant not to kill, but to persuade. Operation Bertram was the deception plan that surrounded Montgomery's preparations, a careful effort to make a huge army appear slower, weaker, and differently placed than it truly was. The battlefield already favored the defenders in some ways, with the sea to the north and the Katara Depression to the south, but the coming attack still depended on surprise, of timing, and emphasis. Rommel's army could not be allowed to read the British buildup correctly. Bertram matters because it shows that armored warfare had become a contest of production, movement, concealment, and interpretation. Before tanks could break through minefields, someone had to hide where they were, disguise what they were, and shape what the enemy thought they were seeing.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
Deception at El Alamein did not mean making an army disappear. That would have been impossible. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, great artillery concentrations, supply dumps, engineer stores, fuel points, and camps could not simply be hidden in the open desert. The more realistic aim was to make the evidence confusing. If the Axis saw movement, it should appear routine or misleading. If they saw tanks, those tanks might be dummies. If they saw trucks, those trucks might be real tanks disguised as transport. If they saw fuel dumps, they might misjudge how ready the British Army was to attack. The purpose was not to create perfect ignorance, but to produce enough uncertainty that Rommel and his staff would make slower or less confident decisions at the critical moment.
The desert gave both sides opportunities and problems. On one hand, the open landscape made concealment difficult, especially under air reconnaissance. Tracks in the sand could betray movement, and a large formation could leave signs that trained observers might read like a text. On the other hand, desert distances, heat haze, dust, and the repetitive shapes of vehicles and supply dumps could be manipulated. A dummy tank seen from the air did not need to fool a man standing beside it with a wrench in his hand. It needed to look plausible through the eyes of a reconnaissance camera or an observer who had only minutes to interpret what he was seeing. Bertram operated in that zone between fact and perception.
The deception had two main tasks. First, it had to conceal the true concentration of striking power in the northern sector, where Montgomery intended to launch the main infantry and engineer assault through the Axis minefields. Second, it had to suggest that an attack in the south was more likely, or at least that British preparations there were too significant to ignore. This mattered because the Axis had limited fuel, limited mobile reserves, and a long defensive front to watch. If German and Italian commanders misread the center of gravity, they might hold strength in the wrong place or delay shifting reserves when the real offensive began. In armored warfare, deception can win time, and time can decide whether a breakthrough becomes possible. One of Bertram's most memorable techniques was the use of dummy tanks and disguised vehicles. Artificial tanks could be built from light materials and placed where enemy reconnaissance would notice them. Real tanks, meanwhile, could be disguised to look like harmless trucks until the last possible moment. This was not a childish trick, though later descriptions can make it sound almost comic. It required skill, discipline, camouflage knowledge, and coordination with movement schedules. A deception that looks convincing one day and absurd the next can betray the plan. The false picture had to be maintained long enough to influence enemy expectations, and then changed quickly enough to allow real forces to take their proper battle positions.
The handling of fuel was especially clever, because fuel is the bloodstream of armored warfare. A tank army cannot attack without enormous quantities of petrol, and fuel dumps are among the clearest signs that a commander is preparing for movement. Bertram used dummy pipelines and staged supply areas to suggest that the British were not yet ready in the north.
while activity elsewhere implied different priorities. The idea was to make the buildup look incomplete or misleading. This detail matters because it reminds us that operational deception is often logistical deception. It is not enough to hide the tanks. One must also hide, distort, or explain away the fuel, ammunition, water, and repair capacity that make tanks useful in the first place.
Artillery and guns were also part of the illusion. The Eighth Army needed a massive concentration of fire for the opening of Operation Lightfoot. But guns are difficult to conceal when they arrive in large numbers and require ammunition stacked nearby. Camouflage and movement discipline helped mask these preparations, while false signs elsewhere encouraged the enemy to draw wrong conclusions. The deception was helped by the fact that both armies expected some kind of British offensive sooner or later. The issue was not whether Montgomery would attack at all, but when, where, and with what weight. Bertram therefore did not have to convince Rommel of something impossible. It had to make the real answer less obvious than the false or incomplete ones.
The human discipline behind the deception was as important as the physical props. Drivers had to follow prescribed routes. Units had to avoid careless movement that would reveal real concentrations. Camps and dumps had to be arranged in patterns that made sense to the deception plan. Engineers and camouflage specialists had to work with operational commanders rather than decorate the battlefield after decisions had already been made. In a large mechanized army, secrecy is not maintained by one clever idea. It is maintained by thousands of people doing ordinary tasks in controlled ways. A single tank track, a badly timed convoy, or a careless change in radio traffic could undermine a larger illusion. Bertram was theatrical, but its theater depended on military routine. Radio deception and signal discipline also mattered. The intelligence war around El Alamein had already shown that messages could be as revealing as vehicles. If units that were supposedly in one place transmitted from another, or if a formation suddenly produced traffic that betrayed movement, the physical deception might fail. Conversely, controlled patterns of communication could help reinforce the picture the British wanted the Axis to see. This did not mean every deception worked perfectly, or that the Axis believed everything placed before them. Skilled enemy intelligence officers were not fools. But deception does not require total belief. It can succeed by forcing analysts to hesitate, by multiplying possibilities, and by making the truth appear as only one interpretation among several.
Operation Bertram also worked because it was tied to real operational logic. A fake buildup in the south was plausible because earlier desert battles had often turned on southern flanking movements. Rommel himself had tried to break through in the south at Alam Halfa only weeks before. The Axis had every reason to watch that sector seriously. Montgomery's true plan, however, aimed to break into the northern and central defenses, where infantry, engineers, artillery, and armor could be concentrated against the mine belts. The deception therefore played on enemy habits and recent experience. Good deception rarely invents a fantasy from nothing. It offers the enemy a story he is already inclined to believe.
There is a useful comparison here with earlier armored warfare. At Cambrai in 1917, surprise depended partly on massing tanks secretly before an attack in a war of trenches and railheads. By 1942, the problem had become more complex because armored armies required huge vehicle parks, fuel dumps, engineer stores, radio nets, and airfields. The more mechanized the army, the larger its shadow. Operation Bertram was a way of managing that shadow. It showed that modern armored offensives needed not only strength, but a concealment plan equal to the scale of that strength. The tank had become a symbol of movement, but the preparation for movement was now so large that it had to be disguised almost as carefully as the movement itself.
Bertram did not win El Alamein alone, and it should not be inflated into a magic trick that hypnotized the Axis command. Rommel's army still fought hard once the offensive began, and many British tanks still found themselves jammed in minefield lanes under fire. The Axis defenses were not surprised into helplessness. Yet Bertram helped Montgomery gain an edge at the start of a battle where edges mattered. It helped protect the timing of the attack, helped obscure the main concentration, and helped reduce the chance that Axis reserves would be perfectly placed before the first barrage. In a battle built on preparation, deception was one more form of preparation. It was a weapon aimed at the enemy commander's judgment.
Operation Bertram deserves its own place in the story of El Alamein because it reveals the invisible architecture behind a famous battle. The dummy tanks, false pipelines, disguised vehicles, controlled tracks, and managed signals were not comic details on the side of a serious war. They were part of the serious war. They remind us that mechanized combat is decided not only by how fast tanks move, but by whether an army can move them without revealing too much too soon. The Eighth Army had learned that courage without coordination could be wasted. Bertram added another lesson: strength without concealment could be blunted before it struck. When the guns opened on 23 October, the surprise had already been manufactured, patiently and deliberately across the desert floor.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.